I was sitting at my desk at Wooddale Church when the phone rang, and I received a phone call that I wasn't ready for. The person on the other end of that line had been a friend of mine for a number of years. He was a bit of a quirky guy. I appreciated him as a youth pastor because whenever there was a need in our student ministry, he was one of the first ones to volunteer. He would give selflessly of his time, and so we worked around his quirkiness. A couple years earlier, he had pulled me aside in a retreat to tell me that he had fallen in love with a woman from our church who was a single mom with a couple of young girls, and he was excited about the prospect of asking her to be his wife, and asked me to pray, and told me the plan and how he was going to propose, and we had this great lunch together, and I'll never forget that day. He was excited because if she said yes, as a gentleman in his mid-50s who'd never been married, he was going to have a chance to be a dad to, actually it was 3 young girls, and he thought that was going to just be awesome to be a dad as well. And so I was happy for him, and I was happy when the woman said yes to him, and I was happy at their wedding and excited for them as a family. And that is why when my phone rang 2 years later with the news that my friend had been arrested for a heinous crime, that I was shocked and I was angry and I was appalled and I was sickened and I was ticked off and I felt like I'd been duped, and frankly I didn't want to show him any compassion. I was more than a little perturbed when my boss at the time said, "Brian, would you be the liaison between Wooddale and this family? They need some ministry right now, and even this guy needs some ministry, and you need to be the one who's going to walk with them." And I didn't want to walk with him. I wanted to say no, but he was my boss, and so I didn't. And I said, okay, I'll walk with this man. And over the next several months, I spent dozens of hours with this man's family. I listened as his stepdaughters and wife shared their pain and shock and anger over what my friend had been charged with. At first, the family didn't believe that the charges were true. Neither did most of his friends. But the evidence became overwhelming, and my friend was charged with the crime. And when there was enough evidence to put him in jail for an extended period of time, I was asked to drive him to jail that morning because his wife and his daughters wanted nothing to do with him at that point. Because I was a police chaplain at the time, I was granted access into the prison. So I checked him in and went in with him as he checked into jail that day, and I watched as my friend's dignity was, which was already gone, was completely stripped bare. I watched as he put on the jail clothes and as the doors closed, and he spent the first night of what would become many years of incarceration. He had gone from a respectable member of society, a valued volunteer, a stepdad, and a husband to persona non grata. And I'd like to say that I visited him often, that I had compassion on him, that I remembered Christ's words about how we're to treat those in prison, but I didn't. My thought as I left jail that day was, you got what you deserved, and don't let the door hit you on the way in. I just didn't want to listen to any more of his sorry excuses, didn't want to listen to any more of his lies. I didn't visit him once. The best that I can figure by researching online, he spent 4 years in prison. And I don't know where he is today. I don't know where he's at in his relationship with Christ. I don't know where his wife and his kids are at. I don't know anything about his life. And I don't feel good about that. I'm not proud of that. I don't stand up here as your pastor and say, I really did a great one on that. In fact, in preparing this sermon, I've been convicted that I need to do whatever I can do to figure out how to get in touch with him and have a conversation. 2 weeks ago, I preached a message on God's heart for the widow and orphan. And in that sermon, I talked about God's heart as it relates to justice. So expected are we, according to Micah 6:8, and hundreds of passages in the Bible, to be people of justice, that it was forefront in Jesus' mind when he talked about the end, that series we're going to start next week, when he talked about what life at the end of the age was going to be like. When Jesus said, hey, listen, there is going to be a time when every man, woman, boy, and girl who has ever lived will stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and you will give an account for how you've lived your life. And in Matthew 25:31-46, Jesus describes that judgment seat. And I read it 2 weeks ago, and I want to read it again. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with them, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another and separate the sheep as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to the least of these of my brothers, you did it to me. And then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. And then they also will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. You know, we've been talking about a lot of populations these past 4 weeks. We've talked about the city, the poor, the oppressed. We've talked about refugees this past year. We've talked about widows and orphans. We've talked about, last week, those who are victims of human trafficking. We read in this passage about also the sick and the elderly. And most of us, when we hear about these communities, know that oftentimes these are called society's throwaways. But no one would admit to willfully throwing away the elderly. Nobody's going to tell you, I don't really care about the elderly. I don't care about grandparents. I mean, if nobody's visiting, it doesn't matter. Nobody's going to admit to that. Although our lives sometimes betray us, because if we really cared, we'd be spending time with people in that community. And nobody's going to admit to being somebody who doesn't care about orphans. I mean, you talk about like the scum of the earth. That would be the person who says, I don't care about orphans. You know what? I know it's a problem, but that's somebody else's problem. When confronted with it, most of us will say, yeah, I do care about it. And I don't, the problem's huge and it's big and there's millions of orphans and what can I do? But when given the opportunity, you've shown as a church, you respond to the needs of orphans. You respond to the needs of the elderly. You respond to the needs of widows. But many would echo the sentiment that I had from my friend who I turned my back on when he went to prison. Many would say, guilty as charged. You're right, I don't really care about prisoners. My family's been hurt in the past. There's been some pain that's there. I've been the victim of a prisoner. I've been the victim of crime. You know, as your pastor, again, I'd love to tell you that was the only time in my life I turned my back on a prisoner. But it wasn't. He was one of many of my friends that I've turned my back on. Over the years, several of my friends have spent time in prison. And now you're wondering, what kind of guy did we hire to be our pastor? Who is he hanging out with, all right? And most of these are people in church. Most of these are friends of mine who have sat in these pews or pews in other churches. And these are friends of mine who have made terrible choices in their life. And over the years, I've repeatedly turned my back on people in their hour of brokenness, not having a heart of compassion that Jesus describes that we're to have for those in prison. Let me tell you, lesson number 1 today is simply this. We need to care about prisoners because Jesus cares. God cares about prisoners. And again, it's one of these principles that's all over the pages of Scripture. Let me ask you a question. Why does Jesus care so much about us visiting people in prison? Why is care for the prisoner an essential part of God's calling for the church? At Woodbury Community Church, if we're going to take the words of God seriously, we've got to be a church that cares about prisoners. Or we're going to be people who say, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not visit you? I don't want to be that person in heaven. So many of us will, again, allow our hearts to be stirred for those who are starving, for those who need clean drinking water, for those who are refugees, for those who need the basic necessities of life, for those who are sick, and rightfully so. God tells us He cares desperately about these communities. But put a prisoner in front of us, and many of us treat them as if they are a modern-day leper. You want to know a huge reason God cares about prisoners? Let me give you a statistic that might rock some of your world today. Statistically speaking, 52% of American men will be arrested at least one time in their lifetime. 52% of American men will be arrested at least one point in their lifetime. And you might say, oh, hold on, back up. That's like more than aren't going to be arrested. Yeah, exactly. 52%. My guess would be that those statistics are similar around the world. Being a prisoner is something that impacts far more people than we realize. Now, I got that statistic from a Wall Street Journal article dated November 17th, 2009. And the journalist was a guy named Carl Biliak, and he wrote, the 52% figure doesn't appear to be too far off base, which may surprise people who don't know anyone who's been arrested. And I love what he puts in parentheses here, or don't know that they know anyone who's been arrested. Because the fact of the matter is, I think every one of you probably knows somebody who's been arrested. You probably know multiple people who've been arrested. You probably have some people in your family who've been arrested. And maybe you just don't realize that. He says part of the reason is that it's a lifetime risk. A lifetime, this is brilliant Wall Street Journal reporting here. A lifetime, he says, is generally a very long time. I love that quote. And then Mark Rank, who is a guy that works with him, he says, Mark Rank co-wrote a recent paper finding that half of American children will be on food stamps between the ages of 1 and 20. Some colleagues were quite surprised. Rank told me, however, the data presented in this paper are quite consistent with other work we've done, where we've looked at long-term risk for adults experiencing poverty or having to use a social safety net program. One of the reasons why these numbers are so high is that we're looking across long stretches of time, which he says is quite unusual in social science research. As a result, individuals and families are much more likely to be at risk of a particular economic hardships and risks occurring. The same could be said for arrest rates. So 52% of American men will be arrested in their lifetimes. Women, I don't have the quote on you. I don't know, I have the statistic on you. I don't know what it is for women, but that's what it is for men. Now, I know that not everybody who's arrested goes to prison. Not everybody who's arrested is going to spend time in jail, but many will. And here's what I know about God. God cares about every one of those people. A couple years ago, another one of my friends was arrested. I have great friends. I was actually asked to drive him to jail too. And this time I promised myself I'd do it different. This time I promised myself I'm going to do it like Christ. This time I promised myself I'm going to love him even though he's difficult to love. In this case, the man had done some awful things. I actually had given advice to his spouse that she call the police and have him arrested. I mean, it's pretty bad when I'm telling somebody, have your husband arrested. She called, and he went to jail, and I visited him the next day, and he kind of cussed me out and was mad at me and angry about what I had done and told his wife to do. Over the course of the next month, he was in and out of jail 3 times. He went to court multiple times, and I drove him to at least half of those occasions in court. I drove him to jail every time he went to jail. I sat with him in court. I let him yell at me. He actually made threats to me during that time. I mean, what a great friend, huh? That's what it's like when you walk with prisoners sometimes. He was really hard to love during those days. And I really wanted to argue with God on it. God, do I really have to love him? Because he's saying things I don't like. He's making threats I don't like. And I kept hearing God say, yeah, and he's kind of mentally sick right now too, and he needs you to love him. And yeah, he's got some issues in his life, and you need to love him. Because nobody else is there for him right now. His wife, who you told to have call the police, she's through with him for now, and rightfully so, needs to be. His kids don't want anything to do with him, and they need to not have anything to do with him. But somebody needs to be there for him, and you're my guy right now. And so I walked with him, and it was tough. He would spend a good amount of time in jail, a good amount of time in rehab. I ran into that friend earlier this week, and his entire life has been turned around in these 2 years. He's walking with Christ. He's boldly declaring Christ to people in similar situations and patterns of addiction that he found himself in. He introduced me to a friend that was with him, and he said, this is my friend Brian. And he said, he saved my life. He pulled me out of the gutter, and he stuck by me when nobody should, and nobody had to go. And he apologized to me So I'm so sorry about what I put you through a couple years ago. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But you know, it's so worth it to me to hear those words and to be able to say, I know where his life's at today. Again, I'm convicted on this other friend. I've got to make a phone call this week. I've got to make some things right with somebody who, again, didn't deserve the grace, didn't particularly want it. His crime was so heinous, most of you wouldn't want him anywhere near your family. But I still need to talk to him. I still need to reach out to him. Because when we love prisoners, it gives us a chance to stand with people at their moment of brokenness. Sometimes we need to allow God to break them before we can truly forgive them. But it allows us to show God's grace in perhaps the most visible way that we can on planet Earth. It's grace to the one who doesn't deserve it. It is a visible picture of what Christ did for us on Calvary. It is us forgiving others as Christ forgave us. It is us loving others who didn't earn it, who don't deserve it, who don't particularly want it, and aren't really going to even appreciate it sometimes when you offer it to them. Colossians 3:12 and 13 is part of our instructions as Christians and how we're to treat others. And it says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. If one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. See, that's part of the beautiful story of coming alongside of prisoners. As we get a chance to forgive others, as God has forgiven us. Grant Snyder's here today, and when I met Grant, you saw the video last week that he produced about human trafficking. We were meeting in my office, and Grant gave me a picture that I don't think I'll ever forget. We were talking about the problem of human trafficking, and we were talking about the men that he arrests as a detective for the city of Minneapolis. And he says, Brian, he says, many of these men are the guy down the pew. Many of these men are people, you wouldn't expect it to be sometimes the people that it is. Most of the time, these are suburban men who are coming into the city. And he says, my job as a cop, I need to come alongside that victim. I need to come alongside that girl. I need to be an advocate for her. And we have some systems in place and some people. And we've got people here at WCC who are involved in trying to come alongside and be advocates for the victim. But he said, we've also got a responsibility as the church, don't we? To minister to people in their brokenness. And he says, as I sit across from these offenders, these people who have done terrible things, he says, I'm sitting across from that man at the moment of his greatest brokenness on planet Earth. Most likely he's lost his family, he's lost his job, he's lost his reputation in the community, he's going to lose a whole lot of money, he's going to lose a whole lot of freedom, and he's broken. And what could the church do to come alongside people like that? And we don't have the answers completely. I mean, we're trying to figure this out. This is a big issue. But there are opportunities for us as the church to come alongside of people in their brokenness, because nobody can speak the language of grace and love like the church, because we've experienced that. Chuck Colson knew a thing or two about brokenness. One of Richard Nixon's henchmen, he was kind of the guy in the Nixon administration who, when Nixon needed something done that wasn't necessarily legal, he had Chuck Colson there to do it. When the Watergate scandal broke, Chuck Colson was one of the people who spent the longest amount of time in jail for his activities in Watergate. Chuck Colson, while in prison, came into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And the trajectory of his life changed forever. And this guy's a guy, a brilliant Rhodes Scholar, just off the charts, brilliant guy who spoke at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford and Oxford and Cambridge and all over the world at these institutions. But he founded a ministry called Prison Fellowship to minister to prisoners and to minister to prisoners' families. And it was a fascinating deal. Colson died last year, but his legacy lives on. Prison Fellowship Ministry discovered while Colson was alive that typically, if there was no prison ministry at a prison, when they would go into a prison, maybe 1% of the population of that prison were true Christians. In most prisons, the prisons they would work with, say 800 prisoners, 8 of those prisoners were maybe true followers of Jesus Christ. Lots of prisoners have conversions. Lots of prisoners will tell you, I love Jesus, and do whatever they need to do to say. But people who were true disciples of Jesus, maybe 1% of the population. When a prison fellowship team would come into the prison and begin to work in that prison, and those were volunteers. You can be a prison fellowship volunteer. I mean, if this prison ministry is something God's calling you to do, there's trainings here in the Twin Cities. You can get involved in doing prison ministry and actually being behind the bars with prisoners. When prison fellowship went into a prison, that number changed from 1% to just dramatically change the prisons. I mean, the percentages are different in every prison, but here's what began to happen. Prison fellowship was invited into countless prisons at the invitation of wardens, governors, and judges, because people couldn't get over the change. They couldn't argue with the change that happened in prisoners' lives when prisoners came into authentic relationship with Jesus Christ. When men and women who were broken came into a genuine relationship with Jesus Christ, everything changed. In fact, on Easter Sunday in 1980, Colson was at Delaware Prison. And he's at Delaware Prison, and there was one prisoner there that was just particularly hardened and tough, and they were just beginning a ministry there, and they did the Easter services for the prisoners, and then Prison Fellowship did about 6 months of work after Easter with the prisoners before Colson would come back. And he couldn't get over the change in the toughest prisoner at that prison, a guy who in those 6 months had given his life to Jesus. He went from being the guy that was getting in fights in the prison yard and getting put in solitary confinement all the time to being the guy who was saying, can we have a Bible study, a prayer meeting where we just pray over the prison guards and pray for their safety and pray? It's just unbelievable. This guy is starting to say, can we do a pancake breakfast for the guards that the prisoners do just to thank them and for having to deal with jerks like us? I mean, the guy's life was absolutely transformed. And when Colson went back and visited there, it became the inspiration for his book, Loving God, which I think is one of the great modern-day classics in Christian literature. Every Christian should have to read Loving God, I think, and should read it like once a year. I mean, it is that good of a book. And in that book, he writes the following. He says, only when I lost everything that I thought truly made Chuck Colson a great guy, being Richard Nixon's right-hand man, only when I lost all that had I found the true self that God intended me to be and the true purpose of my life. It's not what we do that matters, but what a sovereign God chooses to do through us. God doesn't want our success. He wants us. He doesn't demand our achievements. He demands our obedience. The kingdom of God is a kingdom of paradox, where through the ugly defeat of a cross, a holy God is utterly glorified. Victory comes through defeat, healing through brokenness, and finding self through losing self. That's Chuck Colson's story. His life was completely transformed in the broken moments of his life. When it looked like everything was broken, God moved. Johnny Erickson Tada can tell you that. She was a woman who had this perfect life as an athlete and became a quadriplegic. And in her brokenness, due to nothing of her own fault, God's used her to transform so many people in this world. Chuck Colson would say, hey, this was all my fault, but God in that brokenness did something new. God loves it when we do ministry in prisons because God loves reclamation projects. That's what Colson was. And guess what? That's what you are. And that's what I am. It's what every human being who's ever lived has been. And when we see a prisoner and when we minister amongst society's throwaways, we're reminded that there, but for the grace of God, go I. You want to know what Jesus thinks about prisoners? Look no further than the cross. In Luke 23, Jesus is crucified between two criminals. Two others, it says, who were criminals were led away and to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on the left. A few verses later, it says, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I picture that. Jesus, will you remember me? Jesus, please. Jesus, remember me. And he, speaking of Jesus, said to him, truly I say to you today, you'll be with me in paradise. While on the cross, Jesus was surrounded by widows and orphans and the poor and the oppressed. They were all gathered there, many of them watching the crucifixion. Those people groups we've talked about, those people groups he cares about, but so were the prisoners. They were there too. And he spoke to the prisoners and he offered them grace. Lesson number 2, caring for families of prisoners is another way that we can care for the widow and the orphan. I believe that as a church, when we care for families of prisoners, we're caring for some modern-day widows and orphans. While my friend was in prison, this last time I reached out to his son, his teenage son, and even though my friend is out of jail, I still have a little bit of a mentoring relationship as much as that boy will allow me to have with him. He needed a father figure while his dad was away. You know, this care for widows and orphans is one of the reasons that I love the Angel Tree ministry that we participate in at Christmas time. It's a way that as a church we can bless families that are otherwise forgotten. Many of you have made deliveries in the past of the gifts that we collect for children who are children of those who are incarcerated. And some of you have made lifelong friends with those that you've delivered those gifts to. You still have them over to dinner a few times a year, or you have an opportunity to be a mentor in the wife's life or the husband's life of the incarcerated one. Hebrews 13, 1-3 says, "Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body." That little passage is why we do Angel Tree, because we want to remember those who are in prison. We want to show hospitality to complete strangers, just to show them love in the name of Jesus Christ. That's why I love that ministry. But you know what? Verse 3 also gives us one more lesson for today, one more lesson about prisoners. And that is that Christians should remember, care, and pray for the persecuted church. Because every day around the world, people are imprisoned simply because they're following Jesus and living for him in a culture where it's illegal to do so. Many of the Apostle Paul's letters were written from a prison cell. It may be that the author of Hebrews was writing from a prison cell when he called on the church to remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them. I've told you before about the difference that visiting persecuted Christians in the nation of Romania made on me my freshman year of college. Every day around the world, there are Christian brothers and sisters in Christ who are threatened, arrested, imprisoned, persecuted, tortured, and in many cases, even killed because of their faith. We need to remember that. The author of Hebrews tells us to remember as though we were in prison with them. In case you think that this is really just something pastors talk about and it doesn't really happen in the world, well, last Sunday, a bunch of people went to church in Pakistan, and 81 of them were killed when a suicide bomber killed those Christians in that church. The Voice of the Martyrs is a wonderful Christian organization that's doing wonderful work to help us remember those who are in prison and who are being persecuted around the world for the sake of Christ. Their website, if you want to visit it, is simply www.persecution.com. And I want to encourage you to visit it, because when you do, you have an opportunity to live out Hebrews 13:3. You have an opportunity to remember those who are in prison. Their website literally lists the names of hundreds, if not thousands, of people who today are in prison because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And you can go on their site. They have a little prayer link. You can hit the prayer link, and you can hit the country. And if you go to Afghanistan, you're going to see just dozens of names with the prison that person's in, with the city or the town that they come from, sometimes with the names of their family members, that you can begin to lift up in prayer. You want a real practical way to make a difference? We've got a prayer group that's going to be starting here a week from Monday. And one of the things that Voice of the Martyrs does is every year they have an international day of prayer for the persecuted church. And I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. I think churches ought to pray for people who are persecuted. But I also think it's just a bunch of Western Christians sometimes who are trying to make ourselves feel better by having a day of prayer for the persecuted church. And that maybe what we need to do is adopt one or two or three of the names on persecution.com. You want to know how you can make a difference? Begin to pray for those names every day. Just pick a few. Pick one. If you just need to pick one, pray for them every day like you'd pray for your own child. Pray for them every day like you'd pray for your own grandchild. Pray for your own parents. Begin to pray and to ask God to help you remember those who are persecuted. This week, the president of Iran came to the United States, made a lot of, just a ton of news outlets. He spoke at the United Nations, and he is kind of on a tour to try to make Iran look better than it's looked in the past to the international community. And in the midst of that, Pastor Saeed Abedini's plight was once again making national news. Last week marked the one-year anniversary of his arrest, which happened while this American citizen, a pastor from Montana, was visiting his blood relatives in Iran, visiting some family, and he was actually helping to build an orphanage in Iran when he was arrested at the orphanage, helping build the orphanage because of his Christian faith and because he was proselytizing Muslims, they said, in the country of Iran. And he was put in prison, and it's been a year now. He's in Evin prison, one of the world's most notorious prisons. On Friday, President Obama spoke to the president of Iran, first time since 1980 that a U.S. president and an Iranian president spoke on the phone. Monumental moment. And in the midst of that conversation, he asked that Pastor Saeed would be released from prison, as well as 2 other American citizens who are being held in prison in Iran right now. Huge step for our president, who chose not to address that in his United Nations speech this week. The American Center for Law and Justice has a website where over 660,000 Americans have signed it asking that the president of Iran would release Pastor Saeed. So you would think that Pastor Saeed's wife and children would be incredibly bitter about this past year. That Nagma, his wife, would just be furious. And of course, she has been an advocate for her husband. And she has personally had letters delivered to the president of Iran. She actually had a letter delivered to him this week at the United Nations that her husband had written in the jail cell and had gotten to her that now was given to the president of Iran this week. But earlier this week, she addressed the student body at Liberty University's convocation services, their chapel services. And I want to play for you her speech. It's just a short little faith story, but a great reminder of what millions of Christians have endured throughout the centuries, and a reminder to us that our persecuted brothers and sisters should not be treated as throwaways. No one should. Check out this incredible story.
Good morning. It's great to be here. As you know, my husband, Saeed Abedini, is serving an 8-year sentence in Iran's notorious Evin prison, which is one of the worst prisons actually in the world. He's been tortured and abused and forced to, he's been asked and tortured to deny his Christian faith and return to Islam. And he has not. They've told him many times that they would free him and allow him to return to our family, the kids and I, if he would deny his Christian faith. And he stood strong in that prison. He's led many, over 30 people to Christ in that prison. And he's endured an intense time in that prison. He's been taken to solitary twice because in an attempt to break him and have him deny his Christian faith. And the kids and I desperately want him back, but we're proud that over us, he's chosen Christ. Even over coming back to us, he's chosen to stand up for his faith, and not only stand up for his faith, but to proclaim the gospel in that dark prison and bring hope, where many of those people are on death row, have long-term imprisonments. And for me to know that so many of them now know Christ, it makes it worth it. I know his imprisonment is not in vain. I wanted to share something quick with you about my testimony. When I heard about his imprisonment, I got a call in the middle of the night, and my nightmare in a way started. My whole world was taken from me. My future, my best friend, my husband, the fathers to my kids, and my whole future, finances and dreams and everything was taken from me. And I'd always feared what would happen if I lost someone, or if I would go through an intense trial, if I would question God and his goodness. And I reached a deep, dark time of despair. And I reached out to Jesus. And I've known him since I was 9. But I found I connected to him in such a deep way that not only did I not question his goodness, I proclaim his goodness and how awesome he is. And I got to drink of his goodness, and he gave me strength to stand up, and he's given me joy and peace. I've had atheists and Muslims come up to me and say, there has to be something real about your God, because this is not possible for you to stand up and have so much peace and joy and to be able to give it to us. And the world crumbles under pressure, but we not only survive it, but we thrive, because only pressure allows us to even connect deeper with God, Almighty God. We have that. No religion has that. Only Jesus Christ has that. And under pressure, we are broken and we realize our weakness, and we can connect to God, and we can receive even more joy and peace. And the world doesn't understand that, and the world needs to see that in us. They need to see our passionate walk and relationship and love story with Christ. And I would always be confused by something Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12:9. He would say, I take pleasure in my infirmities and my weakness and my, distress. And why does he take pleasure? The Lord opened it up for me during this time, because he realizes how weak he is, and he discovers the strength of Christ. And I just want to end with this. I want to say, in this trial, I've tasted a new intimacy. I've reached a new intimacy with Christ that I pray that our nation and us as Christians would discover his goodness, because the world needs to see our relationship and our fire, the truth of Jesus Christ. We can't be preaching it, we have to be living it. And in order to reach the gospel, we have to experience it first. And I have to say that when he brought me out of this darkness, he's allowed me to preach in front of over 100 nations. I was present in June, and I was speaking in front of the United Nations in Geneva, and over 196 countries are there, and I got to tell them that Jesus Christ is the way to God, and he's the God of peace they're looking for. And Saeed and I had always dreamed to reach millions of Muslims for Christ. I got to do that. I got to go in media like BBC Farsi and Voice of America Persia that broadcast into Iran. Over 50 million Iranians got to hear me on live TV as they were watching, to tell them about Jesus Christ. And so I praise God for that. I don't have a ministry. I'm just the girl who loves Jesus. At age 9, I asked the Lord, I was reading Psalms 2, and I asked the Lord for the nations. In Psalms 2, it says, today I've begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance. I pray that today, the Lord would awaken your desire to ask for nations for your inheritance, that you would be not lukewarm, but you would be on fire for the living God, and you would go out and ask. I would ask when I was 9, I would say, Lord, give me the nation of Iran for my inheritance. I want it. I didn't see it till this year that I got to speak to millions of Iranians. I've led so many Muslims to Christ. Saeed and I have led hundreds and hundreds of Muslims to Christ. And to see that become a reality, I pray that you would ask the nations as your inheritance. God bless you.
Really an incredible response to everything that she and her husband are going through. And one of the things that the American Center for Law and Justice say, she said 30, but they say 75 people have come to faith in Jesus Christ at the jail since he's been there. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing story. So we're praying for his release, but I think they're also resigned to, and God, if that's not what your plan is and your desire is for this time, then use us where we're at. But we need to be praying for folks like this. Remember, some of the Bible's greatest people were prisoners. Joseph was sent there by his brothers. David was a fugitive on the run from a sadistic king. Daniel was placed in a lion's den. I mean, you talk about a prison that looks pretty hopeless. That's one of them. John the Baptist was in prison with a disciple, and had his disciples beg to Jesus to do something about it, but ended up dying a prisoner, beheaded. Jesus himself was a prisoner and died between two thieves. Paul was a prisoner. Peter was a prisoner. Paul and Peter actually many times over, repeat offenders for the cause of Christ. Silas was a prisoner doing his time alongside of Paul. And John, the beloved disciple, was also a prisoner, writing the last book of the Bible from house arrest on a penal island. So why should we love prisoners? Because Jesus does. And when we do it, it reflects his grace that reaches down from heaven and grabs a hold of the least deserving of these people like us. In Psalm 69:33, it says, "For the Lord hears the needy and does not despise his own people who are prisoners." Listen, I hope that over these past 4 weeks that you've been blessed in our series on biblical justice. We encouraged you 4 weeks ago, find an area to plug into. For you, it may be refugee ministry. And if that's the case, we've got wonderful things happening here and ways to plug into that. It might be orphan ministry, and whether that's Safe Families or Cozy Foe or something in between, there's ways that you can be used in orphan ministry. It may be widow ministry. Yesterday we had a number of guys just doing yard work for one of our widows in church, and there may be other opportunities, and you have opportunities to come alongside and make a difference. We have an opportunity to come alongside of those who are poor and oppressed through things like the community cupboard, through some of the justice ministries that we're doing around the areas of human trafficking. I was amazed this week at the Human Trafficking Coalition meeting that about half the people were WCC people or people related to our ministries here. This little church is making a huge difference. You have an opportunity to do that. Pick one area that you're going to say, hey, I'm going to dig in and I'm going to do ministry amongst this group of people as God gives me opportunities to in an intense way. But secondly, we said, but God's going to give you opportunities across every one of these communities too. And when God brings that widow across the street onto your heart and you're supposed to do something for her, you do it. And when God gives you an opportunity because one of your friends is arrested and you get to make your pastor look really bad because you do it the right way, then do it. Make me look bad. Make me look really bad. Okay? I want to see you loving people as God brings them our ways. Each of us, if we make a concerted effort to reach out to at least one of these groups, are going to be so blessed by the service that happens. See, that's the amazing part about following God's precepts. It is absolutely fun. It's a blast to see what God does. And when we do, we find that the rewards are incredible. Ask God to break your heart for society's throwaways and stand amazed at what he does. Would you pray with me as our worship team comes to lead us in our final songs? God, we love you and we thank you that you are a God of grace. And Lord, you even spell that in Scripture that your people who've been touched by your grace are supposed to show your grace to society's throwaways, to prisoners, to people who we say, well, they deserve that. That's what they get for the punishment for their crimes. But God, if we got everything that we deserved from you for what we have done, we would spend eternity, every one of us, in hell. Lord, we don't deserve your grace. We certainly don't deserve your Son, Jesus Christ, who went to the cross on our behalf. Help us to be people who love this world the way that you've called us to do it and embrace the incredible call that you've given to us. Help us to be people who are even willing to abandon it all for the sake of the call. Give this to you in your precious Son's name. Amen.